Yeah, so let's see now how China is going to change its lending practices or not, because coming out of FOCAC with the promises that we've heard about Chinese financial commitment, for me, it's now to look into what China's lending profile will look like for 2025.
I think there's going to be some industry voices close to Donald Trump's ear who's going to be strenuously making the point that saving American companies by just simply buying easily accessible refined minerals from China should be a backdoor. I can imagine some people advocating for that in Washington. They may not win.
The reaction from China is going to be, I think, very interesting towards Africa. And this is something that I've been saying for many, many years, where I don't believe that Africans understand, and I don't mean this in a condescending way, but I just don't think that they understand their value to China is not what comes out of the ground. There is still a perception in many African countries that the value they bring to the international system and the value that they bring to China is the oil, mineral, and timber that they sell. China does not need what Africa has to sell, because it can get larger quantities of it in vastly more efficient at generally lower costs from almost anywhere else along the Belt and Road.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa, and our Africa editor Géraud joining us from the beautiful island of Mauritius. A very good afternoon to both of you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Eric.
Géraud and Cobus, we are here in the last episode of 2024. This is the show that I look forward to most at the end of the year. This is our annual year in review, year in preview program where we take three topics of what we thought were the three biggest stories of 2024. And we have not told each other what our three topics are and what those three stories are. So sometimes we'll overlap, sometimes we'll be a little different. Usually our takes are different, even if we have the same story. So that's going to be the format of today's episode. And it's been a busy year, so there's no doubt going to be a lot for us to cover. We try to cover this in under an hour, but I don't promise today because there's a lot to get through. So let's not waste any time, gentlemen, and get right into it. Géraud, what was your number one story of the year? By the way, not in priority. You can just give us any of the three you want, but give us your first top story of the year in China-Africa relations.
My first would be, of course, FOCAC, the outcome of FOCAC, the angle on the which FOCAC was presented this year. I wrote a column on that a few weeks back during the FOCAC for us, and I was mentioning the political angle, the ideological angle of the FOCAC, that we shouldn't be looking at the FOCAC this year under the economic premises or the numbers, the big numbers, but much more under the ideological and political lens through which China is now looking into its relationship with Africa in terms of future and how to build that strong alliance into shaping the international system. And for me, that was really something that really stood up for one of the things that stood up for me for this year in terms of, because FOCAC being once every 3 years. So yeah, that was one of the main story for me. I wouldn't say I'll follow, but one of the main story for this year in China-Africa relation.
It's a no-brainer. FOCAC is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. It's a gathering that happens every 3 years. So invariably, on the year that FOCAC happens, not a huge surprise that it's going to make one of our top three lists. I intentionally did not mention FOCAC because I knew, Géraud, that you and or Cobus would have it on the list. Now, let's talk about FOCAC very quickly here. You say, and we all said at the time of FOCAC, and we did a lot of coverage on this, don't pay attention to the big number. $51 billion was the outcome of FOCAC. We said, listen, these numbers are a little bit of smoke and mirrors, hard to kind of figure out. That being said, most of the coverage that came out of FOCAC was about the big number. And so I guess, Cobus, were you surprised this year about FOCAC and the takeaways and the fact that people are still focusing on the number? And a lot of the media coverage of that number was wrong. So a lot of people said China is going to commit $51 billion of investment in Africa, which of course is not true. A lot of that $51 billion is in the form of export credits. It's in the form of support for Chinese companies to engage Africa, not direct financial support for African countries and companies and communities themselves. That being said, when you look back at FOCAC this year, did anything surprise you?
In terms of the number and the difficulties around the number, that didn't particularly surprise me because that is roughly how it always goes with FOCAC. And these numbers are very fuzzy always. Most of the people we spoke with who got them right were actual PhD students or people with PhDs, so it's a deep dive. Even for people with PhDs, it's a deep dive. So in that sense, I think that was kind of as predicted. I actually also listed, as you predicted, I also kind of listed FOCAC, but I actually put it in the context of the African Union also joining the G20. So that was interesting for me. It's like that there was this big flashy FOCAC happening and the Africans joined the G20 at the same time. And, so the two together for me, was an interesting kind of indicator of where the African continent is in its international influence. And particularly, I think, the way that FOCAC has managed to light a fire under some people in the West in terms of thinking about what Africa could be in these multilateral forums. I was also cynically joking earlier this year that it may well be that this is the moment when the G20 gets devalued because the African Union got to join. So, I was fully expecting kind of a few months from now, foreign policy putting out the headline that, the G20 is over, it's the G13 now, whatever. I do expect some kind of turn. But overall, what was very interesting for me was the double kind of courting of Africa through FOCAC and the G20.
Okay, but let's talk about the African Union in particular. And they did have a presence at both FOCAC and the G20. So what was the outcome? Did they have any meaningful difference? I didn't see any difference this year at either the G20 or FOCAC because of a more robust African Union presence than I did in previous gatherings of both of these forums.
But that's not how the G20 works. The G20 doesn't turn around so quickly. So the fact that the Africans got, officially joined this year, well, we will only really start seeing that probably in South Africa's G20 leadership next year.
Okay.
Because the G20 agenda set essentially for a full year before. So I don't think the Africans really had much voice in their first year.
But what about FOCAC?
What about it?
You said that the African Union had a presence at FOCAC as well. Did we see any impact from the African Union engagement at FOCAC?
I think that was folded in, as usually with FOCAC, it was folded in with China's general engagement, which is both at this kind of meta level, much higher, even higher than the African Union, and on a bilateral level at the same time. So I think its presence there was felt, and it was, African Union bodies were involved in some of the negotiations beforehand, and those negotiations kind of flowed through some African Union organs in Addis Ababa. But I didn't particularly see a very robust, African Union, specific role of FOCAC. I think it was in there as part of the mix.
But I think that we saw that a lot in the outcome of FOCAC. When you look at the resolutions and the final declaration, we saw a lot of the African continental agenda being part of the resolution at the end. It's something that's quite different from different FOCAC. We had that before, that's true. But the amount of all those agendas was also part of the FOCAC this year is quite important. So I do believe even though it didn't really play much active role into negotiating anything because no African country has ever given it any power to do much, but the Commission tried as much as possible to incorporate, and China also played that card quite well to try to incorporate as much as it can every continental agenda, development, economic, trade and everything into the final declaration in Beijing. So even there we can see there is a bit of African Union touch in that FOCAC declaration at the end.
Okay, so Cobus, you had FOCAC on your list of 3 top stories. Anything else that you want to add besides the African Union in terms of why this was such an important event for you this year?
I think it showed that it's part of China's larger return to the world after the zero COVID era. And it also shows a very robust and re-energized Belt and Road Initiative, I think. So it has a global impact. And I think it repositioned China as Africa's most important external partner in many ways, in many fields. It just kind of reiterated reiterated that, status, even as other emerging partners like the United Arab Emirates, for example, are becoming quite prominent in Africa. I think FOCAC just showed that, look, China is unique, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's something about the optics of FOCAC that are so different than other African engagements in Europe and the United States in particular. We've seen a lot of Africa Plus One summits this past year. And Géraud, this was a topic that we talked about a lot. We have the famous bus incident in Buckingham Palace. Remember in the UK where all of the African leaders were and they weren't just African leaders, by the way, other leaders had to ride buses too. But there was a lot of indignity about African leaders being put together on a bus, and people said they looked like school children being ferried around. We saw at the 2022 U.S. Africa Leaders Summit that Biden met with groups of African leaders at one time and did not hold bilaterals. And yet in Beijing, you saw the pomp and circumstance and the fanfare that each African leader came to the Great Hall of the People in their own Hongqi motorcade. Hongqi is the Chinese limousine cars. And just the ceremony that the Chinese bring to it is on an order of magnitude different than what they get in other capitals. And Cobus, I thought you were going to say something else. I thought you were going to talk about the consistency of FOCAC, and that here we are every 3 years, no matter what, pandemics or otherwise, this thing happens. And so that is something that also stands apart. We, of course, do not know when the next U.S. Africa Leaders Summit is ever going to take place. Congress is trying to formalize that in law, that there is
every 2 years, something like that.
Yeah, but again, it hasn't happened, though. So, and we don't know what this Congress is going to be able to do with the Trump administration coming in. So that consistency, I think, was also very important. Géraud, I'm going to give you the last word on FOCAC before we move on.
The last word would be talking about scandals and the buses and everything. And this is one of those more scandals that went almost undetected, but I've seen that in different parts of African Twitters. Talking about the buses, shocked by the fact that when President landed in Beijing, where they did not take the cars from the airport to where they are going, because at some point they had to take the bus, a Cobus bus.
A Cobus bus. That's the airport buses, that we all have to take out on the tarmac. And William Ruto, he took a Cobus bus.
Exactly. Many of them were shocked. Why they're taking bus? Why they don't take cars over there?
I know.
For me, it was like just funny in so many ways, because I realized that people would want to be frustrated or, hurt by anything. And those are the small scandals for me that were, since you mentioned scandal, and like, yeah.
That was, for me, a curious thing, because the Chinese, who are so obsessed with protocol and optics on this, have this red carpet. They've got the honor guard. They've got the band.
Yeah, they give them everything.
Everything's there. And then they make you take the same bus that you and I have to take when we get hauled out to an airport. Why not have a Mercedes waiting for...
No. They just took this is the point. They just took the bus from the airplane to the salon and where they took the car.
But Géraud, you've clearly not flown business class very often, because oftentimes business class passengers get taken in an Audi from the plane to the terminal. And like the head of state doesn't get driven from the plane to the terminal in a black sedan is just, to me, curious, because when you see Ruto coming off the Cobus bus, Cobus, you must get this all the time, the Cobus bus, you just think to yourself, wow, it's like, it reminds me of these, in the fashion magazines, they'll say, the celebrities, they're just like us. When they ride the Cobus bus, I'm like, wow, they're just like us riding the Cobus bus.
Let me add something. It's eco-friendly at the end. Because this is the point. It's eco-friendly. And I get the people who want to be, feel special, having a limousine, having that. But at the same time, it's those small, tiny issues that we should not be paying attention to.
It's fair enough. But let me assure you that when Vladimir Putin arrives in Beijing, he does not take the Cobus bus when he gets off the plane.
He surely brings his own car, though.
Whatever it is, I think there's a certain hierarchy in who gets the Cobus bus and who gets the Hongqi from the plane, is my guess. But I'm going to go again, not in order, but one of the big stories for me was the rebound in Chinese lending and the report that we got from Boston University's Global Development Policy Center that showed that Chinese lending in 2023, so we got the data this year about last year, rebounded to $4.6 billion. And that is a reversal of a multi-year downward trend of Chinese lending to African countries. That was notable this year, and I think very important in part because African countries have faced so much economic distress, and their access to capital has been even more constricted this year because of interest rates and because of the premiums that they have to pay on Eurobond debt. The cutback in lending from sovereign lenders like the Chinese has made it even more difficult. And so the fact that the Chinese did rebound in 2023, I thought was very notable and very important, particularly for infrastructure-related projects. Did lending end up on any of your lists this year, Géraud and Cobus? Géraud, why don't you go first?
No, lending did not land on my.
Okay.
Lending
did not land on your list. Got it.
List, but yes, this was something noticeable for this year as well, because for many we were kind of wondering what would be the future of China's lending in Africa for the coming years. Seeing that rebound happening and seeing the portfolio of the recipient in terms of where the money went, it was also something interesting to look into.
Just remind everybody why that was interesting.
It's interesting because this year we saw a lot of lending toward financial support to financial institutions in Africa. Multilateral, also national bank have been receiving money from China. I think it was around 2.9 billion in total. And we also saw a rebound into hydropower project, quote unquote, clean energy project, hydropower and other projects in Africa as well. So for me, it was something quite interesting. And especially since in 2022, we came from less than 1 billion to 4 billion for 2023, it was definitely something worth mentioning and noticing as well. And we saw that shift, and we're looking into the portfolio, we can see the small and the smart and beautiful taking shape and taking form into Chinese lending in South Africa.
Cobus, did it land on your list at all?
No, actually, after several years of always putting loan issues on this list, it didn't actually this year. But, it was certainly, the rebound is certainly notable. It's one of those things where you kind of like want to see where it goes, whether it's a blip or whether it's a new kind of like upward trend.
Well, I think it's a very important trend that Géraud touched on, that we're now officially in the small is beautiful. This is the Chinese saying is 小而美, so small but beautiful, small and beautiful. You've heard all the variations of it, but whatever it is, we're in it right now. So this is, the small means sub 50, sub $100 million projects, so less than those amounts. And then beautiful is usually meaning ESG compliance, so environmental compliance and community engagement and projects that are more sustainable and more feasible. That is what the small and beautiful mantra is. We definitely feel it. That being said, I think this is more of an Africa phenomenon than it is a worldwide phenomenon, because the discussions that we're having out here in Southeast Asia are about big railroad projects, big energy projects. So small and beautiful is more for parts of the world that may be less strategically important, because Central Asia, Southeast Asia are still talking about massive railroad projects and things that we talked about in Africa 10, 15 years ago, but aren't talking about anymore today. That being said, if you are not familiar with small and beautiful, you should be. So I think we're definitely in that area. Any other thoughts on lending, loans, debt, all of those issues that did come up quite a bit this year? We just saw the Zambians themselves are finally at the end of this process of getting out of the debt penalty box that they've been in for 3+ years now. Let's put aside, Géraud, the $80 million mistake that they had. But at the end of the day, they have finally resolved, for the most part, and this is what everybody feels like right now, that we're at the end of this process. When you look at Chinese debt resolutions in Africa, whether it was in Ghana, we saw a lot of discussions happen this year, debt restructuring there, Ethiopia, Angola, Zambia, none in Kenya, interestingly, but really not needed yet because Kenya did not go into debt distress the way that those other countries did. What was the debt issue for you this year?
For me, the debt issues was really something interesting to look into, because it was a test. The case of Zambia was a test for China on how China approached debt resolution on the continent. If China is going to be a tough player or is going to be a team player with other lenders in a way that it's really going to help African countries to get off the jam they find themselves in. And I think that for many as well, they were also looking into China, because it was, let's face it, it was quite first time for China to have to deal with this kind of situation. And we saw in the case of Zambia, which Zambia was really trying to defend China, to say, the situation we are finding ourselves in was not China's fault. It's not China's fault in any shape and form, but we'd like to do more about that. So yes, for me, that case, seeing Zambia finding a solution on that, we've talked about that last year. It's a good news. It's a good it's relief finally for Zambia. So let's see now how China is going to change its lending practices or not, because coming out of FOCAC with the promises that we've heard about Chinese financial commitment, for me, it's now to look into what China's lending profile will look like for 2025 in terms of, are we going to see the more in the small and beautiful, or are we going to see what we used to see before? That's where the part of lending that will be interesting to look into. I did a kind of review and preview at the same time on that topic here.
Yeah, let's give Cobus the last word on this debt topic. When you look ahead into 2025, Cobus, and see the development finance landscape in Africa today, including the Chinese, what do you see?
I hope some normalization, some kind of post-COVID normalization. So I hope there'll be more financing available for Africa, because Africa is seriously underfinanced. And that also along small and beautiful lines, that a lot of those will go into projects that have direct economic benefits. I think overall we have a very mixed kind of result after a few years of debt restructuring under the common framework. And in most ways, I think these restructurings have shown to be extremely problematic. And the system has been, I think, revealed as being largely broken. China is playing an increasingly kind of complicated role in there. And I don't have any kind of like concrete ideas of how that will go, but like it's definitely something to keep an eye on, because China's role has become significantly more complicated over the last 10 years, including things like liquidity, support lending and stuff like that, so like a real expansion of the different kinds of lending that China is doing. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. I think like we're not at the end of that story, I think.
But what about the obvious question here that you say that Africa needs more development finance, but at the same time, a number of African countries are in debt distress and can't take on more debt. How does that work if they can't borrow? Where does that money come from? In what form?
Well, that's one of the bigger problems, right? It's not only that Africa has to lend enormous amounts frequently, because I've been spending a lot of time in the climate spaces here, working on big projects, and the way that the lending overlaps with the fact that they have to lend in order to fix problems that they didn't cause as part of a big climate crisis. And then that means that there's an ongoing transfer of wealth from the global south to the global north, even though the problems, the environmental breakdown was caused by another huge transfer of wealth from the global south to the global north. So it's part of this kind of bigger systemic inequity where Africa is marginalized in all kinds of ways, exploited in all kinds of ways, and where the logic of the conversation is set around these terms, as you were framing it, essentially, of like, well, there's only one way to get money, which is lending. And so African countries had better jump through certain hoops in order to be more attractive to international creditors. So that conversation itself is, I think, part of the problem.
Okay. Géraud, let's go down on your list now. Number 2 on your list of the top stories of China-Africa in 2024.
But my second story will be the Angola Lobito / Stazara story.
Oh, you like that one a lot this year. Yes. Okay, let's get into that one. And that was a hot one.
Exactly, because it's a hot one. It comes with all the beauty that we like with Chinese engagement in the U.S. geopolitics engagement in Africa. It comes with all of that at the same time. So for me, it was the second story, how Angola is maybe maneuvering or maybe is leaning toward U.S. or leaning toward China. We don't know, but this is for me was the second story on my list.
Now, it's very interesting because you wrote a column that said the Lobito Corridor project is not an American project. And we also spoke with some senior folks who said that the Tazara Railway is not a Chinese project. The Tazara Railway is a project of the Tanzanians and the Zambians. And so why don't you break those down about these railways, just in case folks at home are not familiar with the two different railways and why they're important right now.
Before getting to the difference, let me just give the background. So the Lobito Corridor project, basically the way we speak about it today, if we speak about it from an American perspective, or if we speak about it from an Angolan and Trafigura perspective. Basically, we have three perspectives here. If we speak about the Angolan perspective and Trafigura perspective, it's the Benguela Railway concession contract that Angola rewarded to Trafigura Consortium, led by Trafigura, Vectoris, and Mota Engel, that won in 2022, when they got a 30 years concession contract to modernize and manage the Benguela Railway, and maybe to extend it, if financial means permit, to refurbish the branch in the DRC and connect it with the DRC from the DRC side. And then from the American perspective, we have that portion plus as Cobus called it a few days back, the whistle and bells around it means the connectivity, the agriculture, the solar plant project, and all of that agriculture, all of that being together. This is the American views on what they call the Lobito Corridor project, which goes from a simple contract on railway and including a whole ecosystem where we see all of that happening at the same time. So we went from a $600 million to some around $4 to $6 billion the DFC maybe is going to disburse for this project. So the Tazara one is the railway that was built by Chinese in 1970s, and China is now being rewarded. Somehow it's been rewarded to refurbish it. They signed an MOU. The negotiation started since last year. The MOU was signing during the FOCAC. It's going to be a $1 billion project where China is going to put money on the table to refurbish it and to modernize it. And that could be an alternative or a rival railway to the Benguela on the other side. Because let's not forget, China was first interested by the Benguela railway in Angola and the port of Lobito in Angola. So when they lost that, now they shift the gears and they went into the Tazara one, for which they had also historical tie with Zambia and Tanzania at the same time. This is the overall background. So now if you want to talk about the perspective of it, I can come to that later now.
Okay, well, we'll get into that in a second. But Cobus, there's a lot of excitement in Washington that the Lobito corridor is the United States pushback on the Chinese. We saw headlines in the Wall Street Journal, in Bloomberg, all over the media that said this is the slapback against the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative in Africa. That was a point that Géraud and I, and I think you as well, did not really understand, in part because, as we talked about on our shows on this topic, the fact is that the Chinese can use this railway, and they will use this railway. The locomotives, they come from China with GE engines in them. And the materials that are brought on that railway, for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, will have to make their way back to China for processing. Now, the Americans have a whole architecture of reasoning as to why this is a pushback against the Chinese. It's not immediately obvious to a lot of people. A lot of disappointment in Africa, though, that the centerpiece of the Biden administration's engagement in Africa is a mine-to-port project, even though it has lots of other things along the railway, business development, business engagement, but that same structure of mine-to-port, or they call pit-to-port projects, is a little bit disappointing for a lot of folks in Africa who were hoping that there was going to be a break from the 4 or 5 century past of extracting raw materials and then finding ways to get them out. When you look back on this year on the Lobito corridor and everything that Géraud said and what we've studied and written about this year, what's your reflection on that?
On the one hand, I agree with Géraud that it's a huge story, and particularly the combination of Tazara, the fact that the refurbishment and reorganization of Tazara seems to be a go. I think that is very notable. I think it's going to be interesting to see how that goes. About Lobito, I have my doubts, I have to say. Like, I was thinking, this time next year, will there have been any actual new construction on Lobito? Will there have been a single railway sleeper laid down connecting, part that still needs to be built? I wonder. Like, I fully expect Lobito to be nickeled and dimed by Donald Trump, and I have my doubts whether it will actually keep going forward. But let's see. I mean, if it does, great, then it'll be amazing.
But the conservatives in Washington, the likes of Peter Pham and Joshua Meservey and a lot of the conservative folks seem to be optimistic that there's going to be engagement with Angola and that Angola will still remain a priority for the Trump administration. You don't seem as persuaded by that.
Well, the thing is, at the moment, I mean, the Wall Street Journal, the folks you mentioned, they are narrative central at the moment, right? It's stories all the time, stories 24/7. So you need a pickaxe to get through the stories, in order to see what's actually happening on the ground. And so far, there's nothing happening on the ground. So we'll see.
Okay, Géraud, will we be talking about the Lobito corridor in December 2025?
Yes, I think we'll be talking about the Lobito corridor in December 2025. This was my point when I say it's not an American project. Why? Because even if the DFC decide, you know what, we're gonna scrap away all the whistles and bells around the project, we're gonna give it up. The concession contract itself won by Trafigura is economically viable. The business plan is sound. So even if the DFC withdraw from the project, the consortium will still find money in Europe or in Africa. let's not forget that DFC is not alone on this project for now. We have the DBSA from South Africa that's also funding the project, at least from the Benguela perspective, for the Benguela Railway perspective. So yes, for me, even if the Trump administration withdraw from the project, the American version of the Lobito corridor project will fall apart, but what was the main core element of that project will still remain, and they're still gonna find funding for that. And this is the part where I say it's not an American project. And this here allows me now to get back to the point where I say people may say that Tazara is also in a Chinese project. No, Tazara is a Chinese project for so many reasons. First, because Tazara, the concession contract, was won by a Chinese state-owned company. This is one thing, first of all. Second of all, China was really involved from top to bottom to negotiating that contract. And third of all, Chinese ambassadors say we're going to put $1 billion into that project. And fourth, Xi Jinping was there to the signing of the MOU. So you cannot come and say, no, Tazara is not a Chinese project. No, Tazara is completely to the core a Chinese project. It's not.
I don't know. I don't agree with that. We don't know the details of what those deals were. So I think, the optics, yes, but I don't know if we can call it a Chinese project, because you remember we talked to that guy and he was like, this is a Tanzanian Zambian project and it's going to always remain in Tanzanian and Zambian control under all circumstances.
No. When I say it's not an American project, it's not a Chinese project, in the sense where in the Lobito, when I say it's not an American project, it's presented as if the Americans were behind the fact that Angola rewarded that contract to Trafigura, which is not the case. Which is really not the case. In the case of Tazara, it's completely different because the Tanzanian and the Zambians really called on to the Chinese government, calling out on the history, the background to say, we want you to refurbish. That's why they even made a closed bidding process, basically not opening to anybody, only to Chinese state-owned companies. So that's completely different perspective. So it's easy to say, yes, it's the same. It's not the same, because there it's much more Chinese than Lobito is not Chinese. Because at the end, look at the difference. If DFC pulls away from Lobito, Trafigura will still find money for that. But if the case happened in Tanzania, it's going to be much more difficult and complex.
So Géraud is dropping a whole bunch of acronyms there, just in case you aren't following along. The DFC is the Development Finance Corporation, which is the U.S. government's Development Finance Corporation, and the DBSA that Géraud mentioned is the Development Bank of Southern Africa. So those are some of the acronyms there. Trafigura, for those of you who are not familiar, of course, is the big global commodities logistics and trading firm. And so they're very active in Southern Africa. And then the reference, Géraud, that you talked about in terms of the signing that maybe folks didn't really follow along with is that Xi Jinping at FOCAC sat with the presidents of Zambia and Tanzania to sign this new agreement. And I think you're weighing that a lot, saying that's very important that Xi himself was involved in the signing ceremony. Is that right, at FOCAC?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Cobus, let's move on to your number 2 story of the year.
Mine was a kind of a compound story, which is basically this wave of elections that have gone across sub-Saharan Africa, where several incumbent parties have been kicked out. So we saw incumbents losing in Ghana, in Botswana, in Mauritius, in Senegal, and then kinda in South Africa. They were forced into a coalition government, and then also like the opposition made very big gains in Namibia, even though they ended up not winning. So none of this is going to change, necessarily be a super game changer in like Chinese engagement with Africa. But I think it is a shake-up for the Chinese, particularly because, as we know, for example, from the work of people like Paul Nantulia, that China has been doing a lot of work in dealing with incumbent parties, in setting up party schools and so on, and essentially thinking of incumbent parties in sub-Saharan Africa as to a certain extent akin to the Chinese Communist Party. And in some ways they are. Like, outside of places like Vietnam, some of these post-liberation parties are the closest, I think, in the world to something like the Chinese Communist Party, even though they're very different. So several of them being kicked out in a row was really interesting for me. And, a lot of this is still an emerging trend. We don't know where this is going. I don't think it necessarily disrupts anything on the Chinese side, because the Chinese are, they always they always build relationships with everyone anyway, with a lot of opposition parties too. And, so I don't think it'll necessarily disrupt the operations. But what I think, what makes it important to me or notable to me is I think it's one of the first kind of signs of what we're seeing, what will be a bigger trend in Africa, which is African Youthquake. right? Kind of like Africa is the last kind of like emerging youth wave in the world. It's the last place where there'll be a majority of young people. And so these elections, I think, is an early kind of whisper of what that could look like. It's an early kind of indication that these young people are at the moment willing to use democratic tools to try and improve their lives. If that doesn't work, then their second option is going to be interesting. So in that sense, like, it's a big story for me, less necessarily about what exactly happened this year, but what it kind of implies for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree that Africa in many ways was the shining beacon in the world of democracy this year. When we look at what's happening in the United States, in Europe, in other parts of the world that are purportedly democratic, they have had scalebacks. Whereas you didn't mention what happened in Kenya this year, where young people rioted against the government and the president responded. Again, an act of democracy there, where he was listening to the people. Of course, you mentioned Botswana. There was an election in Ghana, a young new president in Senegal as well. And the point, though, I think that's very interesting, and we tracked quite a bit of it this year, is not the Chinese government's response, but the Chinese Communist Party's response. And the head of the Chinese Communist Party's diplomatic wing is a man by the name of Liu Jianchao, and he was very active in Africa this year. And they, I think, are quite adept at dealing with the changes in power. They build relationships with opposition parties long in advance of any change of power. So when there are invariable changes of power, the Chinese seem to be quite smooth at making these, adaptations to the new power structure. I don't see any disruption in the diplomatic or political relationships between the old governing parties and the new governing parties on the part of the Chinese. Do you see any friction that's emerging?
No, although it is interesting to see that Namibia has now started an investigation against a Chinese lithium company around like quota, violations possibly.
Which could be coincidental.
It's probably coincidental, but I think more broadly, it just shakes up the Chinese a little bit. Like, kind of like I think they can't necessarily depend on these kind of high level elite links with people who have been in power for 2 decades, that frankly they have done in some countries in the past, and they're not the only ones. I mean, many external powers do that. So in that sense, particularly for an entity like China that does so much on the ground business in Africa, I think some of these actors would have to kind of like rethink their approaches, I think.
If you allow me to add on something on that Namibian story, people may not be familiar with that, but the case that you mentioned, that Chinese company, Sinfang Investment Lithium, has been accustomed to scandal in Namibia since 3-4 years already. So they're not in the first rodeo into having a scandal. So I think it's very much coincidental, the fact that they find themselves again in something related to their mining operations. But just like before, I think they're going to find the way to get themselves out of the jam, because somehow the court and justice in Namibia allowed them to continue their operations, and that was quote unquote a good sign from Chinese perspective. So yes, this is just the one of the point I wanted to mention in that case.
Cobus, another angle on what you were saying is how this really a resurgence of democracy in many African countries and this wonderful display of plurality in many African countries really seems to undermine so much of the hysteria in the narrative that the Chinese government and the CCP or the CPC is trying to impose itself on African governments, and how their African governments are so susceptible and vulnerable to the influences of the Chinese Communist Party that they're going to eventually model their governments on the Chinese Communist Party. That is a deeply held narrative among many parts of the Washington community that is suspicious of Chinese motives in Africa. And here we show that not only is that not happening, but it's not happening in magnificent display. Again, there is no indication whatsoever that African countries want to emulate large parts of the Chinese political system. Certain ruling parties, like the ANC in particular, have said that they kind of like the idea of way that the Communist Party is structured above the state. But you saw that the South African people had other designs on what the ANC's future was going to be like. But in many ways, I think this democratic activism that we see in Africa does challenge that narrative.
Yeah, I think so. It certainly does. And of course, Afrobarometer polling data has also shown that even though China is very popular in Africa, vastly Africans prefer like elections, for example, as the mechanism to change leaders. So African populations are very dedicated, I think, to democracy, or largely. And the popularity of China kind of functions on a slightly different space or a different level. I think it doesn't necessarily directly impact on this one-to-one way in the way that they want to run their own countries.
But one more thing to add on to that, the fact that those democratically elected leaders are still not pro-China, but they still look China favorably. And you wrote a story about that in case of Ghana, where John Mahama, the new president in Ghana, received the Chinese ambassadors looking forward to keep the relationship going with Ghana and China. So this is just tell you that democracy is not really antithetic to the idea to work on with Chinese in Africa.
There's not a single African leader today that I can think of that has said anything in opposition to China. Not one.
And of all of the leaders in the world, I think there's almost no leaders, of all of the ones who've campaigned against China, almost all of them then end up playing nice with China afterwards. I mean, Javier Milei of Argentina being exhibit A, like big talk about China before the election, very, very conciliatory after the election.
Very quick little sidebar here on Somalia. Xue Bing, who is the special envoy for the Horn of Africa, was just in Somalia this past week. And we've talked about Somalia over the years as having a very complicated relationship with China, because Somalia, if you recall, is the only African country and one of the only Muslim majority countries in the world, not once but twice, to sign letters at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva to support Xinjiang and a center of China on Xinjiang. And that was remarkable. But the politics today are very, very different. And so there's a new president that came to power in Somaliland, and Taiwan's deputy foreign minister went to that. Xue Bing was very unhappy about that, issued a very stern warning. So Somalia and China seem to be coming back together again, united by this idea that they both are dealing with breakaway regions, Somaliland for Somalia, Taiwan for China. And so maybe there might be a détente and a rapprochement between Somalia and China after those two Xinjiang letter signings. And so again, not really related to anything, but just something to watch out for that kind of appeared this year as an interesting diplomatic story. Géraud, do you have any comments on that before we move on?
No, I think for me, I'm going to put it in perspective with the rumors that we've been hearing that in DC, maybe Somaliland, we have recognition from the Trump administration. So we're going to have to see how it's going to play out with the dynamic of China in Africa relation. With
that's going to really upset the Chinese. There's no doubt if that happens. And then we had some conversations with folks in the U.S. earlier about Somalia, Cobus, and it's going to be a topic of interest, particularly because the Somaliland is really a favorite of the conservatives.
Yeah.
You've been saying that from the beginning. You have been saying that from the beginning. So, okay. So everybody keep an eye out on the Somaliland situation in 2025, especially for what Géraud was saying. The key trigger is going to be if the United States recognizes Somaliland. That may pave the way for Taiwan then to establish formal diplomatic ties with Somaliland. Taiwan has a representative office right now in Somaliland, a trade office. And remember, African governments have not been very welcoming of Taiwan trade offices. Cobus, we still have a stalemate in your country, in South Africa, as to whether or not the Taiwan representative office is going to move from Pretoria to Johannesburg. The Taiwanese are slow walking this thing right now, not responding to it. It happened in Nigeria, where they asked the Taiwanese to move from Abuja to Lagos. So Taiwan may be an issue on the agenda in 2025 that we didn't have quite as much in recent years. Let me go on to my second story. And this is a little bit of a curveball for you guys, a little baseball reference there for you. Not necessarily the biggest story, but one of the more interesting ones. And I'm going to talk about Chinese e-commerce that started to really take off. We had a huge marketing blitz in Nigeria this year from Temu. Cobus, in South Africa, Chinese e-commerce giants Temu and also Shein have caused a lot of excitement, but also a lot of concern about the flooding of the market with $20 skirts that are coming in without paying any duties. The South African government initiated a response, a tariff response to imports that are valued less than, I think it was $43. They never went through with that as far as I know. Now Temu is starting to come up in other parts of Africa as well. This is exciting for people who have very minimal disposable income because their dollars go a lot farther, but at the same time, it poses an existential risk to indigenous small and medium-sized enterprises. that cannot compete against the China price. In Addis Ababa at Bole International Airport, there is a brand new fulfillment center that was built by Cainiao. Cainiao is the logistics arm of Alibaba that was built in partnership with Ethiopian Airlines to facilitate the goods coming in from China that then can be distributed across Ethiopian Airlines' network to deliver goods very fast. We're seeing this here in Southeast Asia in a very big way. The pushback is beginning. There are tariffs that are starting to come up around the world against Chinese products, but it is something that I think we're going to see a lot next year in Africa is the rise of Chinese e-commerce. Are you guys seeing that in your countries? Géraud, let's start with you first.
Yes, I'm seeing that taking form here in Mauritius as well, where the Mauritian government is also trying to be imposing tariffs on Chinese imported, especially textile product, much more tablecloths and all those kind of product, where they've tried to preserve, to protect a bit of local industry here. But this local industry being also held by Indian or Indian descendant, you kind of have now the mix of the trading, commercial, and also the geopolitics agenda playing into the Mauritian government logic behind how they're approaching those logistic business. But yes, we see the expansion of the commercial footprint here in Mauritius, not only in Mauritius, but also in countries like in many sub-Saharan African countries where, as you say, they're offering affordable options, allowing customers to have good product instead of being stuck with the high-end prices they have with local manufacturers. So we're going to have to see how now governments are going to balance the demand for the local consumers at the same time with what we're going to see with those tariffs putting in place. But for me, those tariffs will only encourage somehow or even maybe boost illegal trading in a way that people are going now to go to China and buy those stuff and bring them as just like their personal items and going just to people going find a way to keep on buying them and selling them in a certain way.
That's right. So you can announce all the tariffs you want, but if your state capacity is not strong enough to enforce the tariffs, whether it's being brought back by individuals or just getting passed through customs by paying off people, then you have a problem. Cobus, Mexico announced a 35% tariffs on certain textiles, I think something like 40 or 50 categories of textiles. They didn't name the Chinese specifically, but I think we all know who they're targeting with something like that. South Africa, again, started to go down the path of putting tariffs on these low-cost imports. They haven't done it yet. Do you feel that that's something that they're going to circle back to later this year? Because it does pose a threat to small businesses in South Africa.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think some of that impact was already felt, I think, in South Africa before, because a few years ago, there was a big wave of Chinese imports, which ended up in some of the kind of low-end, like more affordable, kind of garment sectors in South Africa. And that pushed a lot of local people out of work. In South Africa, it's an interesting, complicated mix. So Temu launched in South Africa. It's very popular. It's popular in my own house. Like, my mother loves Temu, like, among others, because she's a big crafter, and it has a whole thousands of products that are just not available in the South African market. All kinds of like zips with patterns cut into them, all kinds of.
How long does it take for her from the time that she presses buy to the time it delivers? How long does that take? Do you know?
A week.
Really?
10 days max, I think. Yeah.
Wow, that's fast.
Yeah.
Wow.
So on the one hand, that's happening. So it offers a bunch of stuff that South Africans don't have access to in the market anyway, and that is not produced in South Africa. So at the same time, Amazon also launched in South Africa this year after, a long time. And it's actually comparing Amazon to Temu is actually interesting because Amazon is so much more overpriced. It's crazy. It's not only that Temu is cheap. I think Amazon is more expensive than South African competitors. And I'm not 100% sure why that is. But Amazon's launch in South Africa has actually been quite underwhelming. And then at the same time, there's an interesting what I'm seeing in Cape Town. Cape Town is traditionally one of the big garment centers in South Africa. And now that I'm living there, there's this interesting move back to local production by South African supermarkets. So a lot of the supermarkets and kind of like, again, low-end clothing stores have moved away from Chinese stuff and other kind of imported like places from like Mauritius, Bangladesh, and so on. And they're actually now trumpeting the fact that they're producing in South Africa. And at the same time, there's a whole bunch of like, in Cape Town, there's a whole bunch of micro labels kind of popping up with little embedded workshops of people. So there's a kind of a counter trend to Temu, I think, because the South African fashion industry is moving up quite rapidly. Like some South African designers have been showing in Paris, for example, have been doing collabs with like Adidas. So the South African high-end fashion scene is booming. And Africa is one of the last emerging fashion markets, like luxury markets in the world. So Louis Vuitton and so on is have set up in South Africa in the past already. So all of this is happening at the same time. So it's quite a kind of a complicated mix of things in South Africa. But Temu's definitely in there.
But isn't that the ultimate dream and the fantasy of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, is that South Africans will be selling to Nigerians and to Botswanans clothes? But the logistics are the key question. Getting the products there affordably in under a week is something that I think is very difficult within intercontinental trade in Africa. I mean, it's faster to come from China.
Right. And I mean, it's because of all of the problems with rail lines and so on, yeah.
Right. And to go from South Africa to Nigeria is going to take longer than it is to come from China to South Africa. Well, listen, we're rounding the last lap here. Géraud, your final, most important subject and topic and news story of 2024 in the China-Africa space.
My third story will be the misfortunes of CNPC, China National Petroleum Corporation in Niger.
Oh, okay. And I didn't have that on my bingo card. Okay. You threw us a curveball there. Tell us about CNPC.
So CNPC is the China National Petroleum Corporation that's operating a pipeline in Niger. They put like 4 billion to build that pipeline that goes from the north of Niger to south to the port of Seme in Benin. And since last year, the pipeline has been up and running. And since last year as well, we had the coup d'etat in Niger where General Tiani ousted President Bazoum. So with that, given that context, China CNPC find itself in a bit of a difficult situation because there was a tension between Niger and Benin because of the coup d'etat, because of the sanction that was supposed to be taken against Niger, and also because Benin allowed French presence on its territory, and which Niger saw as a threat to it, so they closed the border. So because of closing the border, Benin decided to close down the pipeline on his side, which is really basically put CNPC in a very difficult situation, finding itself obligated to play mediators, peacemakers once and twice and 3 times, trying to fix the issue to allow them to allow the fuel to flow from Niger to Benin. That was done, and still a bit of shaking that in that situation. But the biggest problem that CNPC is having now is with the junta now in Niger, which is the biggest problem they have right now.
Cobus, this question of oil pipelines in West Africa is very interesting because at the time, initially, when this fight between Niger and Benin broke out, the Chinese embassy, backed by CNPC or vice versa, seemed to be handling the situation quite well. And it looked like they brokered a deal. And Géraud, stop me if I'm wrong at any point in my recollection of this story. The initial phase was that, okay, guys, you guys are fighting. You both need each other. We're going to help you come back together again. This was listed as among the accomplishments that China put on its list as a new global mediator in solving international disputes. Then, Géraud, as you pointed out, a few weeks later, it all fell apart again, and the Nigerians and the Beninis couldn't get along with one another. Where are we today right now with this oil pipeline? Is it pumping oil out, and is it working, or is it still blocked?
It's pumping oil, but at some point, as I said, the problem moved from Benin, Niger to Niger itself, where now the Niger government starting to put pressure on CNPC. I don't know if you remember, earlier this year, around April, the Niger government asked CNPC to lend him $400 million. It was a bit of coerced in a sense where the Niger puts CNPC in a situation where it was saying, if you don't give us the money, we're going to open the bid, allowing other companies to trade the oil that's going to come out of the Agadem, which CNPC had the rights to. But because of that, CNPC had to put $400 million on the table, with the obligation that the government will reimburse within 12 months with 7% interest rate. But after that, what had to happen, since Niger is kicking out basically all foreign companies and CNPC remains among the one foreign company remaining, and the Niger government having money problem, what it's doing, it's now asking more and more money to CNPC, basically making the CNPC a piggy bank where, when I need money, give him the money. If you don't, I'm going to close this. And they've done that twice. They took away one of the oil permits, and now they're threatening to close the pipeline. And mind you now, CNPC also has to fend off against the fact that there is a rebellion movement which comprise of all the former President Bazoum allies who saying that, we're going to attack the pipeline, because when CNPC gave those 400 million to Nigerian, CNPC basically chose side. It was our friends before, now it's friends to our enemies. So we're going to attack the pipeline to shut it down. This is the situation CNPC is finding itself now in Niger.
When I'm listening to this drama that's been unfolding here, you think back that in 2008, China sourced almost 20% of its imported oil from African countries. By 2018, that declined a lot, and now we're less than 9% and going down. When you hear this kind of drama, you can see why they just don't want to deal with this anymore. I mean, just forget about it, because in Brazil, in Russia, in the Persian Gulf, they don't have to deal with it. Cobus, you have been a long advocate of China stopping oil drilling and oil pipelines in Africa. I think the ECOP is a kind of project that's the East African crude oil pipeline that the China National Overseas, CNOOC, CNOOC,
Yeah.
China Overseas Oil Corporation, that's what it is. They've been involved in with Total Energies. This is a great way to get the Chinese to stop doing oil projects in Africa because it's just such a headache. And let's see how they respond to this. But Cobus, what's your take to what Géraud's laying out?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. It's like, I guess on a larger level, it's an indication of how the Sahel crisis is shifting that entire region. And particularly also because they were expelling Western armies and so on as well. So overall, it's worrying for that region, I think, because it does tend to, particularly as Géraud was mentioning, the kind of a counter wave of people supporting the previous leader, starting to raise the possibility of attacks and so on is very concerning. At the same time, it's like, well, oil does tend to lead to stranded assets. So, oh well, boo-hoo, I have a lot of schadenfreude against oil companies, so, you're not getting a lot of sympathy from me, but yeah.
No, I get it. But at the same time, the promise, and again, I know this is just fantasy and it's never really panned out that well in most countries around the world, but this was going to be one of the main ways that Niger and Benin would generate hundreds of millions of dollars that could have been used for development and for the betterment of those countries. We know full well, after decades and decades and decades of watching petrostates manage their money, that very little of that money would have ever made it down to the people themselves. But at least there was a promise of it, but that promise now is completely gone. Again, it's naive to think that it would have made it down and to benefit the people, but at least that there was some hope there.
That was one of the arguments that China CNPC put on Benin's side when he said, you know what, you are getting 25.4% of the revenue that's coming off the oil that's going to crossing your country, crossing your port. So you have every reason to keep the pipeline open. And this is really one of the elements. You know what, this is money for you, money that you do need. So find a way to do something else with your dispute with Niger, but please don't touch the pipeline. Yeah, Benin stopped touching the pipeline, but now Nigerians are threatening to touch the pipeline.
Okay. Cobus, now, over to you for your last, most important story of 2024.
For me, one of the most notable one is, again, it's somewhat of a compound story, but a wave of Chinese investment into North Africa around electric vehicles, particularly. So that we saw what the Chinese battery maker Gotion is what he's calling a mega factory, is kind of, or gigafactory, it's putting up in Morocco. Like the reporting I read has talked about like around 8 different Chinese battery companies interested in different kinds of investment in Morocco. Several other auto component manufacturers are also setting up there. We're also seeing similar kind of investments coming into Egypt, including BAIC signing for a joint venture to produce electric vehicles in Egypt as well. So all of this is very interesting. It's of course happening as Europe and the United States have been threatening China with tariffs on electric vehicles, or have imposed some of them already. And these countries may well also be targeted, because as Chinese companies have offshored in order to avoid the tariffs are now finding ways of finding them. But all of it is a very interesting development, to sell to Europe, sure, but also particularly to sell to the Middle East. Because, the other mega trend, I think, is despite the ruinous war that's going on in the Middle East at the moment, Chinese companies have been very heavily investing there. And there's been a lot of investing, like cross-investing from places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia back into China. So the Middle East and China is like, there's very strong investment flows going back and forth between them. And these kind of North African developments potentially feed into those, and they also potentially feed into like if Africa can, like as Africa gets the continental free trade area actually up and running, they are perfectly positioned to export to other parts of the continent as well. So it's a very interesting mega trend, which was compounded by the fact that Xi Jinping visited, like in this unscheduled sudden visit to Morocco on the way back from the G20 summit in Brazil. Like once Xi Jinping shows up, things are official. So it's a very interesting kind of mega trend, I think.
Well, you picked a great topic, Cobus, because Géraud and I just did a deep dive on China-Morocco relations in last week's episode. Géraud, you have been following China's engagement in Morocco quite closely this past year, not only for the automotive sector, but also in the lithium mining business, and as we heard from Oxford Economics Africa about the prospects of increased Chinese fishing in Moroccan waters. Tell us more about China-Morocco relations that Cobus identified as a really important trend.
Yes, it's really part of that China strategy toward the European Union to the US, and also it plays out into China's profile, economic profile in Africa in the coming years, in a sense where China is looking now to places where you have strong economic landscape, when you have a very solid governance allowing you to send FDIs, and because also Morocco has been wanting to attract a lot of FDIs because he wants to create his own middle class, to strengthen its middle class, importing a lot of equipment to develop his own industry. So basically, Morocco finds itself in that space where really it's positioning itself as a winning, not only winners, but also ideal partners to what the future of China's financial economic engagement could look like. So this is really what's happening. And we also saw in that podcast, we mentioned the case of fishery industry, because there is apparently a license of fishery industry that's up and running. Maybe European company will lose the license to be fishing on Morocco waters, which may be attracting Chinese fishing companies legally to do that, given that we have reporting about illegal fishing of Chinese ships in the west coast of Africa and the east coast of Africa. But having them now in Morocco waters legally, it's going to be something also interesting to follow. So we have a lot of dynamics happening around Morocco and China that's going to have to look into and pay careful attention to.
And let's not forget that Morocco is one of the very few countries in the world that has a free trade agreement with both the European Union and the United States. That may be very attractive to Chinese companies, as Cobus pointed out, who may want to be trying to circumvent some of the tariffs that are coming down their way after Trump takes power in Washington in January. So we could see a surge of Chinese investment. But if that happens, then watch out, as Cobus warned as well, that the Americans may sniff out that's going on and they may slap the Moroccans with tariffs as well. That's a concern out here in Southeast Asia, that a lot of countries are seeing a wave of Chinese investment come, but at the same time, it's popping up on the radars of the Americans, who may then implement sanctions there as well. I'm going to finish our discussion today with my number 3 story of the year, and I am surprised that neither of you picked up on this. Critical minerals. Nobody said the words critical minerals. Géraud, what are you doing? I mean, you are the critical minerals guy.
It was too obvious. It was too obvious.
FOCAC was too obvious, but you went there. I mean, like, okay.
I was sure that one of you would have picked up on that, and I was like, nah, that was too obvious. Yeah.
Well, you were right. And so let's talk about critical minerals this year. And I think it was an absolutely essential year, in part because the Americans and the Europeans really amped up their rhetoric a lot that they want to do more to counter China's dominance in certain critical mineral verticals. Géraud, you participated in a number of different conversations, both in Europe and in Africa, on this very topic. You've had a lot of conversations with American stakeholders as well. While we have not seen a lot of movement on the ground beyond the rhetoric from the Americans and the Europeans, boy, oh boy, have we seen a lot of movement from the Emiratis, the Kazakhs, and also the Chinese as well. Let's just put a couple dots on the map for our discussion today. As Cobus mentioned, Morocco, that is now the site of a $300 million Chinese investment in a lithium operation that's there. Zimbabwe gained more momentum as not only a place to mine lithium, but also to do some of the early stages of refining. New deals were done by the Chinese in Nigeria. And then, of course, we have your home country, Géraud, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where CNPC, the world's largest cobalt mining company, emerged as Congo's largest cobalt producer, displacing Glencore this year. That was a very big deal. Of course, we have these battery metals, nickel, cobalt, and lithium, that are at record low prices. We could not figure out all year, why is CNPC continuing to produce massive amounts of cobalt even though the prices are so low? We concluded that it was for geopolitical reasons, in order to keep Western private enterprises on the sidelines and from coming in to compete with the Chinese. CNPC, in an interview with us, challenged that. They told you, Géraud, that the reason why they are producing so much cobalt is because it's a byproduct of their copper productions. You are not 100% convinced on that answer, But let's kind of talk about the year in critical resources. I don't like calling it critical minerals, even though everybody does, because cobalt is not a mineral, it's a metal. So I think people are calling them transition resources, transition minerals, whatever you want to call it. Géraud, you are the resident expert in this field. Was it as big a year as I'm making it out to be?
Oh, it was a big year when you put it on the large scale, what's happening around the world. It was a really big year. We saw a lot of movement happening on the continent to a certain extent because we saw a lot of concentrate of lithium spodumene, which is the very early stage of lithium processing happening in Zimbabwe because Zimbabwe has been demanding and asking for it. And Chinese companies have been responding with putting now at least 5 lithium spodumene concentrated in Zimbabwe. We see one opening up in Nigeria, and we have discussions of one maybe opening in Mali as well with Gangfang mining lithium there. But yes, overall, there's a lot of movement happening. We're going to leave Morocco on top within that supply chain debate. We're going to leave Morocco there. But in Africa, we saw all of that happening. We also saw that, DRC asking for CMOC to expand his operation beyond cobalt, maybe to look into nickel. But the answer they gave us during the interview, they say, no, we're going to stick into cobalt and copper, try to expand even our footprint in these minerals production, not really going in other minerals that DRC would want us to look into. They didn't say that, but this is the understanding that we do have on the understanding of the response they gave us. But as you mentioned, I was not really convinced by the answer about why they keep on producing a lot of cobalt, because Glencore decided to cut output of cobalt last year, which they did. So CMOC could have also done that, even though it's a byproduct of cobalt and copper. They could have decided, you know what, we're going to cut off the production of cobalt for this year. We're going to focus on copper, which they did not do. So I believe that there is a certain logic behind that. There is a certain thinking behind that. I don't want to speculate like Jose Fernandez from the US did, but there is, when you look on different indication, different elements, you may think that there is maybe an ulterior motive behind that approach.
So, Cobus, for the past several years, we've been talking about African countries moving up the value chain, getting out of the bottom of the pyramid of just extracting raw materials like cobalt, like manganese, gold, name whatever you want that comes out of the ground, and they want to process more of it locally. This has been a huge American talking point, that we're going to come in and we're going to help Africans move up the value chain and we're going to let them process their that's kind of all BS, because we have not seen any American movement on that front as far as I know. They're going to tell you, but there's cobalt in Zambia, which again, very aspirational. They're a company backed by, I think, Gates and Bezos, and you met with them in Washington. They have big ambitions for Zambia, but again, we haven't seen the processing that's happening there. The irony, though, Cobus, is that the reason, in part, why African countries are not going to move up the value chain is because of China. That it is going to be cheaper to ship this stuff to China, where they are going to benefit from subsidies in factories for water, for electricity, for real estate, for any number of government benefits that undercut the ability of African governments and other global South governments and companies from competing with China on price. So the Chinese are a major reason why African countries are stuck at the bottom of the value chain, because the China price cannot be beat.
Yes, I think that's definitely a very big factor. There may be other factors involved that, in addition to political factors, there may be other business factors involved in why some of these companies might want to expand and diversify in Africa. But I think the structural role that Chinese provinces play in this, and the way that it was kind of set up frequently as economic development initiatives in China, makes it very tough to challenge. And I don't think there's any real kind of counter pressure coming from other, competing investors, no matter what they're saying. Because when you look at most of the plans for the US, a lot of that refining, they wanted to happen in the US or in Europe. The first shipment that went out from the Lobito corridor went to Baltimore, as far as I understand, for refining.
But it didn't need much refining, though, as Géraud pointed out. It was so pure, that it did. And Americans will tell you that until they see how god-awful dirty refining actually is. And then they're going to be like, I don't want this in my community. And Europeans aren't going to want it either.
Yeah, but I think overall the situation in Africa and the situation in China are results of larger economic structures that ultimately benefit the United States and Europe. So it's the funniest thing for me to hear Europeans and Americans talking about how they're going to be moving Africa up the value chain, because Africa's position at the bottom of the value chain is because of Europe and the United States. I mean, who else? So there's that, but also the outsourcing of all of this dirty industry, dirty environmentally, ruinous labor-wise, to China. So that's also benefited the United States and Europe for decades, right? So all of this are structures set up around European and American power. So that may change, maybe, but I don't necessarily see it changing, maybe for environmental reasons. The Republicans are planning to gut ESG, so who knows? But at the same time, also simply because of cost. I think there's going to be some industry voices close to Donald Trump's ear who's going to be strenuously making the point that saving American companies by just simply buying easily accessible refined minerals from China should be a backdoor. I can imagine some people advocating for that in Washington. They may not win, but I think there's no surprises in the fact that Africa is struggling to move up that value chain, because that was Africa's position for centuries.
Cobus, you mentioning that just reminds me, talking about industry, the American Albemarle, who's the largest lithium producer in the world, is an American company, said there's no way of decoupling with China on that. We're going to need to work with China to make it at cost. There's no way we're going to produce it in North America or in Europe at cost to be competitive. There's no way that's going to happen. Just one of the voices, and a very important one.
Yeah, but none more important than the man by Donald Trump's side all times now, 24 hours a day, none other than Elon Musk, who sits there very right into the president's-elect's ear and is saying that we do deals with Zhejiang Cobalt in Indonesia for Tesla. Tesla, I think, generates a third of its revenue from China operations. So you may see a moderating influence coming from Tesla and Elon Musk that maybe, just maybe, they're not going to compete as much with the Chinese on the critical mineral side, or at least talk about it, because I haven't seen a whole lot of competition, really. By the way, Géraud, they did approve some new mines in the U.S., but I don't think that any of these mines in the U.S. are going to be anywhere near the size of the Tenke-Fungurume mine, for example, in the Congo. So the scale of U.S. mining is starting to ramp up a little bit, but I don't think it's going to be in a way that's going to compete with what the Chinese are doing in South America, Africa, and even to some extent here in Asia.
Yes, I think U.S. is the largest lithium reserve in the world.
They can't get it out of the ground, though, because of the regulations.
Exactly. They have the potential to do that. So it's basically up to them to decide, do we want to do it or not? If we want to do it, we can make it, and we can really have a largest lithium mining operation in the world. But I don't think they want to do that, because for one thing only, the fact that lithium is so widespread in the world that when you think of like the cost and benefit, you say maybe it's cheaper to let ally country to produce them and us buying from them than us destroying our own environment for our own good somehow. So I think in terms of cost and benefit, they're going to choose to keep on importing from other friendly countries than producing them themselves.
And of course, one key trend to watch in 2025 is the changing battery technology. So NCM batteries, that's nickel, cobalt, manganese batteries, are falling out of favor in many respects. And that's really bad news for the nickel that comes from Indonesia and the cobalt that comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Instead, we're hearing more about lithium phosphate batteries, which have closed the gap on power and range for NCM batteries, and then also sodium-ion batteries using salt. And so these are new technologies that will change the battery metal landscape and the politics of this. So we may see, for example, that the Lobito corridor just isn't as important as it used to be if cobalt is not as important as it used to be. We still need a lot of copper, though. Copper prices remain very, very high, and in part because copper is not only something that goes into EV batteries, but it goes into pretty much everything. In the wiring in our walls, in power plants, in technology, and all sorts of uses of copper. So I think copper prices have not gone the same way as a lot of the EV battery metal prices. Okay, gentlemen, we've made it to the end of our show. Almost, not there yet. We've looked back on the year. As you can see, we all had very different topics. Now the job is to look forward to 2025. I suspect there's not going to be very much diversity in what we think is going to be the big story of the year in 2025. Cobus, you are going to get the first crack at it. Tell us what you think is going to be the big story of 2025. And I don't even think I need to hear what you have to say, but let's go ahead and do it because I mean, if you're not going to say what I think you're going to say, then I'm going to be very surprised. But let's hear it. What do you think is the big story of 25?
The one that I was focusing on, for me, I don't know that it's necessarily the biggest story, but it's definitely a notable story, is the fight between the United Kingdom and Mauritius around the Chagos Islands.
Okay. Did not have that one down on the list. I got to be honest. You did not put the orange man down. Okay. That was...
Well, there is an orange man connection.
Okay. Tell us a little bit more about this because this was a very distorted story. And there was this hysteria in Congress that the Chinese are going to take over Diego Garcia. Tell us a little bit about why this story is important.
So Mauritius struck a deal with the United Kingdom, which took years and years to negotiate. The United Kingdom, as part of its waning empire, still has this death grip on this little archipelago next to Mauritius, which rightly belongs to Mauritius. So they've now made a deal with Mauritius to hand it over. And part of the deal, so the thing you need to keep in mind is that one of these islands is an island called Diego Garcia, which houses a big military base, an air base that's jointly used by the UK and the US. And they were, for example, they were flying bombing runs on Afghanistan. They were flying from Diego Garcia. So the Mauritians struck a deal with the UK for a 99-year lease, where the UK would control that one island for 99 years, and that would then, in theory, kind of ensure the free use of that island for the US and UK militaries. Since then, the new government of Mauritius have said that they're not happy with the deal. They have suggestions, and they feel the deal isn't really fulfilling what Mauritius needs to get. They now threw the deal back to the UK. They're in negotiations now. No one knows what the new suggestions are. They don't know what the problems are with the old deal. It's all very interesting and funny. Meanwhile, the UK is melting down. It's like the full display of the UK's waning influence in the world, because you can just feel the kind of imperial kind of shift where they're like, but why aren't people listening to us, And then at the same time, also these UK people like Nigel Farage are back and forth in Washington, and he's been making the point that MAGA people are extremely upset about this deal, and around the idea that Mauritius has too close ties to China, and that then gives...
Which is not true?
Yeah, I mean, it's not... Mauritius does... I mean, they have a free trade agreement, but they're not particularly pro-Chinese.
No, they're not.
So all of this is both new geopolitics, this kind of thing where every single thing in the world is about China, and and every kind of country's election is somehow framed by its effect on China. But it's also fascinating in terms of old empire, old kind of Western colonialism, and how it still has such a grip in parts of the developing world, and how China's playing into that, and how that is then driving up anxieties in places like London. So all of it is very, very funny for me. So I guess this is it's like a comedy, actually.
Yeah, that is a fascinating story that came up on our radar quite a bit this year, but we didn't dive into it as much as I think we should have. So I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm hoping we'll do more analysis on that next year. And since Géraud, how often do we get a Mauritius story that's this big? So this is on your doorstep. We're counting on you to give us more on this story next year. Géraud, let's go with a story that you think people should focus on next year.
Okay, for me, a story that people will be focusing on 2025 will be the role and the positioning of China around Africa demands for permanent seat at the UN Security Council.
My goodness, you guys did not pick at all what I thought you were going to pick. Wow. Okay. Keep going. These are great topics, but I thought we were all going to be U.S., Donald Trump, great power competition, but okay.
Don't you worry, I had that in my list among the things I was thinking to look at, but no. For me, that's the obvious one. But one of the stories I think we should be looking into, out of the FOCAC, China made this statement they're going to support Africa demand on the change of Security Council, permanent seat and everything. And we also had that different dynamics playing out within the BRICS, where we learned that there was conditions where the additions of other members, the additions of new members within the BRICS came with the condition they're going to support South Africa, Brazil, and India claims to permanent United Security Council seats. And now we saw in last October how Egypt and Ethiopia kind of blocked the discussions and made it just quite difficult now we have China on one hand in FOCAC say, I'm going to support Africa as a continent in the demand. On the other hand, within the BRICS, kind of without conditions favoring South Africa. So my question is how China intend to navigate the different demand and different support and different claims from this permanent seat coming from countries like Nigeria, coming from Egypt, coming from Ethiopia, coming from South Africa within its influence in Africa. So for me, it's going to be one of the things to look into how China is going to maneuver that, because China saying that we want to reform the international system is going to have to make up credible promises and approach and solution to those African countries in a way that for it not to lose its influence or interest in Africa as well.
Well, I'm going to say what you guys did not say, that by far, in my view, the number one story of 2025 is going to be the great power competition between the United States and China. I think it's going to change everything. I think that the incoming Trump administration is going to be incredibly disruptive to the existing international order. Now, the reaction from China is going to be, I think, very interesting towards Africa. And this is something that I've been saying for many, many years, where I don't believe that Africans understand, and I don't mean this in a condescending way, but I just don't think that they understand their value to China is not what comes out of the ground. There is still a perception in many African countries that the value they bring to the international system and the value that they bring to China is the oil, mineral, and timber that they sell. China does not need what Africa has to sell, because it can get larger quantities of it in vastly more efficient at generally lower costs from almost anywhere else along the Belt and Road. What China values from Africa is politics. And I think you're going to see, as tensions with the United States amp up next year, quite a bit, no doubt, you're going to see the Chinese lean into those 54 blocks of votes at the United Nations. You're going to see this enthusiasm for the BRICS, for the global development, security, and civilization initiatives, this parallel international governance architecture that Africans have been very instrumental in supporting the Chinese on. Things like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And even though that's not an explicitly Chinese initiative, it's part of an alternative system to the West. And so you're going to see a lot more of that. We're hearing rumors that Xi Jinping himself may, even make a visit to Africa. And I think that will be the first clue that the importance of Africa. Now, he made a visit in December, so we don't know if he'll go back in January, but it's probable that he will go back for another visit. He will definitely be in South Africa for the G20 summit, right? So he's going to be back on the continent again. But I think that the Chinese are going to lean on Africa for political reasons and political support, and to try and isolate the United States as much as they can on any number of different issues, on human rights, on governance, on technology, on Huawei, on you name it, Gaza, all of these different things. And so as it gets bumpier in Washington, it's going to lead to the Chinese to be much more engaged. This is a moment for African governments, though, to step up their negotiations with the Chinese, to say, listen, if you want my support, you're going to have to do this for me. And I don't see them trading that way, using their political leverage, still thinking more about what they can sell out of the ground. I'd like to get your two reactions to this before we go. Cobus, you go first.
Yeah, it's not only kind of tougher negotiating bilaterally, but particularly collective negotiating, I think would be really important. I agree. I think this is going to be, Africa is going to play a big political role. It's going to be adding to a mega trend that I think we saw emerging at COP29. This is my line at the moment, is that those people who think of geopolitics as East-West are not paying attention, that the real geopolitical split is North-South. And I think that's what we really saw at COP29. It was a hard line between global North, global South. And China plays into that very, very cannily. And it plays into that cannily in Africa particularly. So I definitely think across all fields that's going to be a kind of structuring factor. And I think if I could make one recommendation to African leaders is get those cheap solar panels now. They are going to be cheaper now than ever because the Chinese are facing tariffs everywhere. They have so much riding on the idea that they are this kind of dominant green energy partner to Africa. Africa should be using that and paving the continent in solar panels. Like, that should be their 2025 goal. But let's see how that goes, because, like, the one thing that African leaders, unfortunately, like, African priorities are very low on the priority list of African leaders. So that's it frequently, quite dispiriting in that sense. But let's see how it goes.
Yes, that's going to be the center point of all defining moment of China-Africa relation, the dynamic that the new Trump administration is going to bring, not only in the world, but also in Africa. Our show with Cameron Hudson gave us some insight into understanding how Trump administration is going to be unapologetic about country choosing between China and the US, choosing between the US and other partners. So that's definitely going to create a tension, and especially how African countries are claiming themselves to remain independent out of this geopolitical fight. So definitely around all those issues, UN Security Councils, critical minerals, all of that will be really defined by the new dynamic of the U.S. China relation that's going to come out after Trump take office in January 20th.
I agree. So that is going to be the year that will. We'll get back to you in December 2025 to see if Lobito is still an issue, to see if CNPC in Benin is still an issue, to see, we'll get an update from Cobus and Géraud on what's going on at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. So much to look forward to. And then again, a lot happening in the space this past year. What we also like to do at the end of every show at this time of year is really to just give an incredible heartfelt thanks to all of you who have listened to the show, who write us every day, and who just engage with what we do, who subscribe to our service, who subscribe to the podcast, who follow us on YouTube. It's such a privilege for us to be able to do this work. There are so few places now available that do fact-based, non-agenda, non-partisan type of coverage on these issues. And the fact that we get to do it every single day for you is truly just an incredible honor. And I just want to express on behalf of the entire team how grateful we are for all of your support over the years. This has been, for Cobus and I now, Cobus, we're going into the 15th year doing the show. I mean, it's just mind-numbing when we think back to what we did and what we started back in 2010. Never thought that it would take us to 2025. We're closing in on 1,000 shows now on this podcast. I mean, it's just really incredible. We did 80 shows alone this year on this platform. So really just a huge thank you to everybody who's been supporting us and continues to support us, and just all of my appreciation. And also to the team, to you guys, for the hard work that you put in every day to make the CGSP really just a world-class platform that now 25 governments are using, thousands of readers around the world. We have institutional subscribers in libraries in Asia and the United States and Europe that are using our service. We're being cited more and more in academic research and congressional testimony. And I just saw, for example, in testimony to the Singaporean parliament that we were cited. I mean, it's a huge honor.
Absolutely. And thank you to everyone who supports us, from funders to listeners to readers, subscribers. We super appreciate it. And Eric, I'd also like to just, express from the team appreciation to you. You have a multi-hour hamster wheel day every day of the week, and it's very, very intense. And yeah, thank you for that.
I'm blushing now. It's red cheeks here.
People don't see how hard you work on that, and really you made the organization running and moving forward, and really like to extend my appreciation and your support into the job that we are doing here. And yes, behind that, there is a man who wakes up really early in the morning and grinding us on writing newsletters and writing stories.
Yes, I'm the pushing hard, I'm the mind boss, we have to increase our output all the time. It's the media business is a tough business to be in. I'll tell you that. It's a brutal business to be in. So
yeah, and 2024 has been a tough year for us as an organization, but we've managed to pull through. We've managed to remain afloat. We managed to keep the business going, and this is in part thanks to our supporters who've been there, who are still there, who are supporting us on YouTube, on Patreons, and else and everywhere, reading us. Even if you're not giving money, but you reading us, you recommending us to other people, you quoting us, you calling us to be part of media or to be part of a media coverage of media stories. It's always something that we really appreciate. And I'd like to shout out to all those media where we've been called to comment comment on a story around China, about China in Africa, China in the world. We really appreciate that. We appreciate that recognition to the work that we are doing, and we are looking forward to 2025 to keep on doing the same thing, to keep on one time being pro-China, next time being against China, pro-US against US, and just bear with us. This is
pro-African against African. I mean, you are the biggest critic of African governments of all of us here, so, don't leave them out.
So this is the business we are doing, trying really to bring that nuance and factual information to you guys so you can be smarter about what's happening in the world, what's happening with China, so you don't get carried away by powerful and strong narrative that comes with billions of dollars of investment, but that's not always true to what's happening on the ground.
And if you would like to support the work that we are doing, there's lots of ways to do that. The best way to do it is to join as a subscriber. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Subscriptions are very affordable at just $19 a month. And if you are a student or a teacher, you get half off. Email me using your academic address, and I will send you the links for the discounted subscriptions. We also have a donate link right on the homepage. So some people say they just want to support us, but they don't need to get the newsletter or a subscription. We appreciate that as well. And then a big heartfelt thanks to our Patreon community who Géraud manages and has outreach with. We just got some new supporters this week alone. And so we're so grateful for all of our Patreon supporters, because without their help, we would not be able to be here today. So for the last time in 2024, for Géraud in Mauritius and Cobus in Cape Town, I'm Eric Olander. We'll be back again next year with another full year of episodes of the China in Africa podcast for the 15th year of this program. So for the guys here and our team around the world, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.